All right, good morning, everybody. We are here today to talk about how to build sovereign cloud environments. I'll introduce myself. My name is Beau Lechanger. I'm a principal engineer within Amazon Web Services. To my left here is my colleague, Randy Domingo. He is a senior software delivery manager on the team. So today, we're going to introduce the concept of digital sovereignty. And really, this is a code talk. We do want to kind of talk about the problem statement at first in terms of what digital sovereignty is, how customers are having to address this, the challenges that they see from a global perspective. It goes into really what is the choice around controls that are adoptable for you as an organization and what they're doing. And then we're really going to touch upon how AWS is kind of taking this approach and how to approach it from a sovereign cloud perspective. And then how the landing zone accelerator on AWS, the solution that Randy and I manage with our team, the concepts that we've taken utilizing the AWS CDK will go low level in terms of how we're addressing these challenges for large scale customers. But to understand digital sovereignty, again, it's very important to note that a lot of times customers and organizations really coming in AWS, as they're bringing their business into AWS, they're having to manage large swaths of data. In today's time, the landscape is always evolving. From a regulatory perspective, at a global point, we see a lot of regions, like especially in Europe, where the regulatory compliance are changing at a very rapid pace. So customers are not just having to manage their own security standards that adhere to their business needs, but they're also having to adhere to regulatory compliance needs as well. So from that perspective, as you're managing your data, you need to understand, from a learning perspective, what controls are available to me, how do I evaluate my threat model in my environment, what controls are there, but I also need visibility into my environment as well. So that's where customers want control over their digital assets and how to really manage that data in the cloud. They want that control and choice of which prescriptive controls they can use to safeguard that data from various scenarios like data exfiltration, still have that technical autonomy, so they're not essentially restricting themselves from innovating in the cloud. So as we start talking about sovereign cloud, I did mention that customers are operating in various regions. Sometimes we have customers that are US based. You have other enterprise level customers that are more scalable in the sense that they have a more global presence. And that's where it gets really interesting from an enterprise environment in terms of how we're layering controls, how we're allowing different segments to talk to one another. And at the same time, again, as part of the shared responsibility model, customers need to be able to control their data and have the choice of how they secure and manage that data in the cloud. So from that perspective, we want to give customers the flexibility in determining how am I layering on my preventative control layer, how am I handling my detective control to gain that audit and visibility into their AWS ecosystem so I can ensure that I have a strong, secure security posture in the cloud. So what we've seen with customers as regulatory environments evolve over time, customers are concerned. AWS, as we want customers to bring their business in the cloud, we constantly preach the ability to innovate and move faster. But as we've seen, Randy and I, many times, customers also have to understand how can I ensure that I have a strong security culture, right? And that's where customers are having to lean on, can my environment operate within the AWS partitions, where I'm able to take full advantage of all the services and capabilities that AWS provides? Or do I need to go into a more sovereign cloud perspective where I may be more restrictive? And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But customers should have the ability to choose, and I think that's where we kind of talk about the digital sovereignty pledge, where the AWS landscape if you keep up with our services, we're rapidly innovating and providing more choices for customers. For example, over time, one of the big pain points for customers was, VPCs and understanding, within my network, what did that traffic look like in terms of, having a centralized view. And then recently we enabled VPC encryption control. So being able to see, at a centralized view, what plain text communication is going on in my environment. And customers want to be able to take advantage of more prescriptive controls like that and understanding where the threats are in our environment. And that's part of the pledge. The ability to continue to still evolve on our services, make them more strong for customers to operate in the sovereign cloud partitions, where we provide that existing capabilities and really expand upon that. So that way they can continue to build regardless of the access restrictions that they can still apply to their workloads. And again, we also talk about, everybody's aware, generative AI is a thing now. That is a technical stack that has now been brought into the landscape and introduces, from a security perspective, a lot more challenges that business leaders, including CISOs, need to be able to understand. How can I exactly still maintain that level of innovation, but at the same time, again, provide ensure that our security posture is still strong with AWS. I've delivered with a number of customers across a large number of verticals. Randy has as well, across a variety of industries, some very highly regulated. As we start talking about platform readiness, you see a lot of these AWS services here. They all play a key part. There's no one service to rule them all. I can't layer on like networking controls and ensure that that's also going to provide identity access management. The idea is here, and this is where the landing zone accelerator solution comes into play, is to kind of stitch all these elements together. And at the same time, too, ensuring that we are identifying and reducing security risk within our ecosystem, protecting networks. Also, at the same time, safeguarding that data, preventing various scenarios like data exfiltration, especially when we start working with highly regulated data. If you're working in various regulatory frameworks as well, that's a typical nightmare scenario that you need to always safeguard for. This is a lot of compliance requirements, but again, from the AWS lens, I think we're up to 143 security standards and compliance certifications that AWS supports. So some of the popular ones that you may be familiar with, are FedRAMP, GDPR, HIPAA. Very common, NIST 853 is widely used amongst a lot of customers as well. So this is kind of a large scope ahead of what LZA, the solution, is trying to do in terms of deploying these scalable controls within your ecosystem, especially as you start to scale out your environment. So this is where we're going to start talking about the landing zone accelerator itself. So I kind of kept mentioning security compliance regulatory frameworks that customers are having to adhere to, and that's also just the base layer where customers still need to adopt their own security controls that don't fit within that framework to better safeguard a lot of their digital assets, especially when you start working in a lot of highly regulated environments. And that's where those environments is where the LZA solution in and of itself was built from, where we designed it to be open source. This gave us more feedback from the overall community in terms of making sure that we have the most secure solution possible, where we operate beyond just the normal partitions, but operate in GovCloud and other partitions as well, again, for those really highly restrictive customers that have deep security requirements, right? So the idea around the LZA is we wanted to provide a really balanced approach, focusing on extensibility, visibility, as well as modularity within the solution. And Randy, again, will kind of touch upon that a little bit more as he starts really deep diving on the solution itself. But again, it's a model configuration that we've seen a lot of customers use, within like DoD, NatSec, a lot of our public sector customers, and even venturing into the private sector from a global perspective. So we definitely leaned on the LZA rather, leaned in heavily on the AWS Cloud Development Kit as well as the AWS CDK for a lot of that dynamic provisioning that you'll kind of understand how we're utilizing that base technology. So the LZA solution is tied fairly closely with the AWS Control Tower. So from that perspective, when you are operating, you are establishing your own landing zone and layering on your own prescriptive controls in terms of, how these controls adhere to your business needs. LZA with Control Tower is, something that we highly recommend for all our customers to use. Understanding that AWS Control Tower, when we start talking about those sovereign cloud partitions are not available and some other regions aren't, and that's where that modularity component comes in from the LZA side. So you're still able to take advantage of LZA and all the governance resources that we can provision in your environment. But again, as we start talking about, platform readiness, there's a lot of design choices that come into it, such as, how am I layering on my preventative controls where I take advantage of organization policies like SCPs, resource control policies. How do I prevent data exfiltration? Like, hey, do I prevent these workloads that are meant to be isolated? Do I prevent like VPC peering, internet gateway attachments? Do I want to make sure that my network traffic never leaves, right? And again, you start taking a lot of these security concepts like incident response, identity access management, and that's where you kind of see, again, how all these elements in their own security pillar kind of are stitched together, again, to maintain that security posture within AWS. That's also where, again, Randy and I, developed the LZA universal configuration. So to kind of give a level of abstraction here, LZA is a solution that utilizes the CDK. It is dynamically provisioning out your environment based on your inputs. The configuration is a prescriptive guidance where, and we'll kind of go into some of the security workbooks that we've developed to frame against various compliance frameworks when we initially designed this, right? But we essentially wanted to have global representation of regulated customers. So as the LZA is a globally adopted solution that we've seen in the ANZ, EMEA, NAMER, we've had to ensure that we had security compliance workbooks that map to those respective frameworks like GDPR, C5 in Germany, NIST 853 is a widely adopted framework as well. And we really wanted to make sure that we had a support model that continuously iterates on this, and Randy and I will be able to provide those links for you to consume. But yeah, you see the universal config in and of itself is based on our well-architected framework as well as security reference architecture to ensure that, again, we are maintaining that strong security posture, aligning those controls to those regulatory standards. And we've also, if you take a look at it, networking starts to become a thing where, there are various WAN patterns that are supported in the LZA, and we do have various network security and network profiles based on what is your use case, right? Somebody will. Not every customer is the same. Other customers have various business challenges and security challenges that they have to adopt, and that's where we wanted to provide options for customers where they can still take advantage of that industry and regional guidance packages, as well as, again, the extensibility layer that LZA provides when you start talking about various ISV products, because again, customers coming into a cloud may be very strong in a particular technology that they want to lean on in the cloud, as they have to come in with tight deadlines. They want to still lean on that service capability to ensure that they are maintaining that security posture within AWS. So again, the LZA, from what we've seen with customers, I've started in AWS back in 2016, I believe. I've been doing landing zones with customers since 2017 now. This used to be a very long process, and a lot of that time is once we got a picture of what the landing zone would look like, the development phase came in, and that's where LZA is really trimming that development timeline down. We're taking care of that orchestration, all the orchestration elements for you. so that you don't have to. And that's why we've started seeing the global adoption of LZA in and of itself, where we can lean on a lot for like greenfield customers, leaning in on those highly regulated industries and provide that multi-account structure that is really needed, right? Especially again, it's very just from even a small environment, customers have to be mindful of their disaster recovery or business continuity planning requirements that would necessitate them operating still at a multi-region landscape, right? And that's where you need to start having that, those scalable controls in place. So I mentioned some of the workbooks as well. We've, you'll find these workbooks in AWS Artifact as part of the universal configuration and how we've architected and designed the universal config that is up for public consumption as well. But this is just a snippet again of like NIST 853, which is widely used in terms of, from an auditor perspective, they'll want to see in your environment, how are you handling this particular control, whether it's at a preventative detective layer, understanding how to respond to incidents. And that's where the LZA comes in for you. And at the same time, we've layered on those controls to kind of at least, again, accelerate that ability to maintain, compliance within your environment. C5 is another one that we've seen from a regulatory perspective, especially out in Europe, and that's why the European Sovereign Cloud has come about, is that their regulatory frameworks are changing very, very fast, and it's very difficult for customers to keep up with those changes, and at the same time adhere to those compliance regulatory requirements. So from a usability perspective, and then I'll kind of hand off to Randy to talk more about the LZA solution. It is open source, so as you're using the LZA solution, you can reference our implementation guide, install in your environment wherever you want. You can file feature requests, issues, anything related to the LZA solution, and our team will see it. The interaction with it by default, and there is a lot of extensibility and feature availability for the LZA solution by way of YAML configuration files. We wanted to make that user experience very seamless, where you're not having to understand AWS CloudFormation at a deep level. We want to give you a YAML configuration that we're taking your inputs and we're ingesting that into the LZA engine, which is using the CDK. And then from there, as we're taking your inputs, we are handling that multi-account, multi-region scalability for your controls. So that's it at a high level. Randy, I'll leave it to you.
Thank you. All right. So I'm actually quite excited. This is a code talk, so I get to really dive into the code a bit here in the LZA. So I'm going to start kind of high level down. We're going to work our way through an example of one of the configuration options that the LZA allows you to do. Specifically, we're going to be setting up Security Hub through the LZA. I'm going to kind of go through how it's normally done and some of the orchestration steps, how we configure it through LZA, and then we're going to dive into the code base. So the LZA, like Bo was saying, is open source. So there's obviously no secrets in the magic that we're doing there. But one of the things that we don't get to do often is really walk through how we are utilizing the CDK to be able to go, touch all of the accounts and regions within your environment here. So this is a pretty kind of standard setup. This is the account structure that we have within our universal configuration. So kind of a standard security OU with a workload OU here. We do break it up generally within kind of our dev test prod OUs, but here just a generic workload OU. And then our management account is our root account here. So when we're setting up Security Hub and we want to set that up across the whole entire environment, we need to, of course, make sure organizations is enabled. And then from that management account, right, our root account, if we wanted to be able to go delegate and configure Security Hub into a security audit account or security tooling account, we need to go enable it in that account and pass the delegation over to it. And then finally, once that delegation has happened, we want to also ensure that all of our workload accounts are configured, so that way we also have situational awareness of what's happening in those accounts. And then finally, if you've used Security Hub, there are some frameworks that do require some config metrics and alarms to be in place, logging events like CloudTrail, feeding it in. so that way it could go in and help identify findings and configure it. So again, pretty standard architecture here for many of the AWS security services that you want to have delegated over to a separate account and then enabled across your whole entire environment and then across all of your regions that you have enabled. But you'll see, right? So 6 steps here to be able to go get that done if you were kind of going through the console. So in the LZA, as Bo was talking about, we use YAML files to be able to go describe the environment that we want to build. So in this case, what you'll see is the kind of the top level here, the delegated admin account. We want it to be our audit. This is just setting up one standard, just the foundational security best practices. And then you'll see the series of config rules and metrics and alarms that we have configured as well. So if you're familiar with the LZA, I've used it before, this is in our security config YAML. These are the inputs that go into the LZA to be able to then drive the CDK engine. The net result is that you end up with the CloudFormation templates that will deploy out all of those resources. So there's about 14 resources just to be able to go enable all of the architecture elements that we had in the diagram before. What this doesn't take into account, though, is all of those orchestration steps, right? So the landing zone accelerator also has a deployment pipeline that's with it, and it understands the A, then B, then C orchestration and dependencies that need to be done, and what stacks need to go when. So kind of working our way down now. Again, like I said, the LZA is an open source project. That QR code just goes to our GitHub repository. If you wanted to go in and look at the code there, that's where our documentation is. That's where we take intake from our customers and that's where we put out different roadmap items and issues and kind of our release notes for our solution. The way that our mono repo is broken up, it is a TypeScript project. We are using TypeScript because it is CDK. We are exercising the CDK directly. So we just wanted to stay very tight and close with the way the CDK project is built. There's 4 major modules or packages within our mono repo. We have our top-level Accelerator project that has our top-level CDK application and all of the different stacks that are represented when you go deploy out the LZA. We have a separate config package because we share that across our code base. So we just, leaning in code and had it as a separate library. And then same with the library approach, any of our custom constructs that we're building. So again, we want to stay very close to the paradigm that is CDK. So again, you have your stacks, and then the stacks utilize constructs. Those constructs represent collections of CloudFormation objects or resources that you want to have deployed. So any of our LZA specific ones we keep in our constructs library. And then finally, we've extended out a little bit past the CDK, and we've been building out a module library as well. And these modules can be used outside the LZA, they can be integrated. But what this allows us to do is a lot of the things that we were historically doing in custom resources, we're starting to move those over into modules so we could just go call the APIs and the service clients directly. So we are going to get into code, and all code and design documents start with a flowchart. So here's kind of the call flow for what we were building out earlier with the Security Hub use case. But again, it is a CDK application, and it all starts from our Accelerator project. So from the Accelerator package, where you go in and we load in our configuration, we ask the config library to load it for us. It does some initial validation checks, make sure that the syntax is good. And then after that's loaded, we start working through each one of the stacks that we have as part of the solution. So that then goes over to our modules. We have moved, again, like I was saying, some of our items that we had in custom resources, we're just calling the modules directly now. One of those are, for example, setting up our Security Hub frameworks and just ensuring Security Hub is working. And then finally, we start really getting into the meat of the CDK project, or the CDK stack here. In this case, we're building our security resources stack. Our security resources stack has the config rules, the metrics and alarms, among other kind of security service related resources that are in there that it deploys. But those constructs and those libraries, if they're from our custom constructs library, we'll fetch them out of there. But then when we're able to go use the ones that are, that are resident in the normal CDK project, we'll utilize those as well. So, yeah. So I'm gonna start working our way down. We're gonna go kind of look at the code a little bit. This is our kind of create security resources stack. Little call out here. We have built the landing zone accelerator to be able to go to work in every region, every commercial region, as well as our non-commercial regions and other partitions in here. So a big part of our code from day one was ensuring that we are writing region safe and partition safe code. So if you're in partitions like GovCloud or other regions like that, the LZA will work in those environments. So this specific stack, what's great about CDK is it allows us to be able to go write higher level logic, right? We can go in and understand whether or not the stack should even be included or built out as part of our deployment engine. So in our pipelines, what you'll see is that we have the orchestration of we're doing our organization steps in this stage, we're doing our security resources in this stage, we're doing our networking in another. We go in and we verify at that stage that we are doing the right stacks that are there. And then lastly, if you're familiar with CDK, it's just a pure invocation of our security resources stack. So we instantiate that object. We pass in the descriptions. We have our own specific synthesizer that we're building, so that way this allows us to be able to go in and deploy and synthesize multiple stacks at one time. We are really trying to take advantage of the compute that we're on to be able to go generate all of the hundreds or thousands of stacks that we'll have to deploy across the environment that you may have. Great. So kind of double clicking, what does that security stack actually look like? We're trying our best. We know our code is open source, so we know that we have customers and partners that are looking at it, so we're trying our best to keep it as readable as possible. And this is a literal pluck of that constructor within that stack. So you'll see that we try to go encapsulate into functions the smaller pieces. This has made it easier for us to test. We can go in and test each one of these functions at a much smaller micro level. And then kind of the theme of reInvent this year makes it a lot easier for our AI tools to be able to better understand the code that's there. So if we're leaning in and using tools like Curo and all that to be able to go in and help us evaluate some of the code and help author it. So we'll click in a little bit further. So we're looking at setting up the AWS config rules here. This is the create AWS config rules function. And you'll see in that YAML file we had a list of rules that we want to deploy. And this is pure serial logic that we get to go take advantage of because we're inside CDK. So again, other solutions, CloudFormation is great. However, the reason we have CDK is so that way we can make a little bit more logic-based decisions as we're deciding what resources we can put in our stack. CloudFormation does support logic, but if you're familiar with it, this is a lot more easier to go express when it's written as code here. As we work through that list here, we're able to go see whether or not the rule is a custom rule or if it's one of the regular managed config rules, and we just pass that on over to our constructs library or the standard CDK constructs library to go instantiate and build out those config rules. And then, if the other features that we support with config also supports remediation. So if you have custom remediations for any of your managed rules or remediations for any of the rules that you define in general, we would be able to go in and deploy those there. And then finally, one of the big callouts here is that this is a CDK project. It is ultimately CloudFormation that's generated at the end. With the Landing Zone Accelerator, we're able to go determine all of the dependencies that are happening with resources that are above it. So in this case, we know that we can't create our config rules if we don't have the config recorder enabled, and the config recorder is also deployed in the stack, kind of north of the function. But we have to set those dependencies to ensure that the config recorder is generated before any of our config rules are done. And the same is true all across the board for many of our stacks within the Landing Zone Accelerator. One of the value adds that we have in there is to really make sure that it's able to go handle those dependencies. And then finally, what you'll see is the CloudFormation, right, that generates it. Those are the CloudFormation that's generated by the CDK. So kind of, we talked about it a little bit earlier, as far as, that's how we build these environments, the definitions of what good looks like as far as environments, and how to be able to go in and have these secure environments. Both touched on a little bit with our universal configuration, but these links here are to kind of two sites. So the first one is a blog that kind of goes into a lot more detail about what we're doing from a digital sovereignty perspective, utilizing the Landing Zone Accelerator. And the second one is our universal configuration for the LZA. What you'll find inside that GitHub repository is not just the configurations themselves, but the documents. So we try to really go into detail about the rationalization and the reasoning that we had of like why our OU structure is the way it is, why we chose certain config rules. So a lot of the reasoning behind the decisions that went into that architecture to be able to go then give you the information needed when you go look at our compliance workbook that's an artifact, and looking at it more from the controls perspective of why was that config rule added, or why was that SCP added, and that clause there. So, lastly, I'm going to go back a slide here because I kind of wanted to get through all that because I know there's going to be questions and all that. We want to leave room for questions, but we are part of the CloudOps talk track this year, so come check out the kiosk. There is swag there. So I'm going to go back to this because I saw people kind of taking pictures there, but kind of happy to answer any questions that might come up. Happy to discuss the LZA in general, and then kind of how that fits in with the use cases that y'all have. If there's any questions. Yeah.
There's a question regarding AWS Sovereign Cloud. Once it's launched, we have to deploy two LZAs. One's global AWS environment or AWS operation, and at least a second LZA directly.
Yeah, I'll try to repeat the question here. So once the Sovereign Cloud region is launched, will I need to go deploy out two LZAs, one in our global regions and then one in the sovereign regions? So did I capture that correctly? I think. Yeah. So the answer there is, depending on when we talk about the sovereign regions, or we talk about even our commercial regions and you're building it out there, you can go deploy out your LZA today to be able to go build, specifying the region that you want to have it deployed in. As we start expanding out and we start talking about separate partitions that are not part of our commercial region, those don't have any connection points between each one of the partitions, right? So that would be a separate instantiation or a separate landing zone that you would be building out. Because the best way that you would think about it is, even if you're doing this in commercial regions, you're going to have two separate organizations. You're going to have two separate management accounts that are there. So, and then that kind of affords you the opportunity to decide, right? Like some customers want to just stay within that sovereign region, or if you have use cases or compliance to be able to go utilize both, then you would have both of those environments. Okay. Yeah? Any other questions over here?
When will LZA support a new security hub? I guess the one that is not supported is CSPM.
Are you talking about the features of Security Hub or the Security Hub frameworks?
The security hub, the new service.
The CSPM. Yeah.
Currently it's CSPM.
Yeah, we've definitely received market signal from customers, right? Like one of the feedback mechanisms we have since, we are open source is we see it internally and externally. So I think we're aiming for second half of, no, not second half, some apologies, second quarter of 2026 right now on our roadmap for that service. Oh, yes, you.
So for the module input, it's basically all YAML files to populate how it's going to lay out the landing zone.
Yeah.
And to me, that screams kind of, with all the AI talk, of some sort of agent to help guide that input. Do you see anything like that on the roadmap?
Yeah, I think it would be, so the question is, with the YAML file and the editing of it, definitely all the talks of agents and AI tooling that's out there, how does that relate? I think it's safe to say that we are leaning very heavily into the AI space. So when we're talking about MCPs and ensuring that the structure of our YAML files is amenable to those tools, we're very much looking in that space. So yes, the LZA is definitely moving towards that direction. Hopefully more information to come very soon on that. Yeah. Cool. Question up front?
Yeah, I'm just wondering about migration or implementation. So there are probably not a lot of organizations here that are greenfield. We already have a landing zone. It's hopefully already infrastructure as code.
Yeah.
Have you had contact with customers that have moved to this solution and what experiences are?
Yeah. Yeah, so the question is around migration. So yes, we've seen a lot of customers that have already existing landing zones, existing organizations, right, existing resources that are already deployed within AWS, and how can they go take advantage of the landing zone accelerator? There's kind of a few approaches that we've seen, all the way from one spectrum where customers are looking at it as an opportunity to go retire that environment because it was kind of stitched together and be able to go migrate those workloads over. So treating it as a greenfield. And then we've also seen customers just piecemeal utilizing, let's say, the security services of the LZA, right, to be able to go in and take advantage of your SCP management and your security services that are there, and just, once you have production workloads and your networking is pretty set and all of that's pretty static, you tend to not want to go touch that. That being said, with CDK and CloudFormation allowing resource assumption and management of existing resources, that is something that we were looking at to be able to go allow imports into the LZA of existing resources so we can go interact with them and start managing them going forward. It's also a focus of kind of our modules here to be able to go understand what has already been deployed in an environment like Security Hub, and then looking at the configuration that's provided, be able to go then shift it to that manifest, if you will, right? That explicit, I want it to be able to go look this way. So.
Sorry, maybe a follow-up question.
Sure.
So how strict do customers follow your organizational structure and your OU structure?
Yeah, so the landing zone accelerator is broken up into, so the question was how strongly do customers have to adhere to the organizational structure and account structure that's within the landing zone accelerator. So the LZA is broken into two parts. One part is the deployment engine. We kind of went through the code base a little bit of how that works. And then there's the configuration that you feed it, which we have within our, for example, our universal configuration. The engine itself will deploy out whatever you tell it to deploy through the YAML file. So you can tell it, I want this organization structure, I want these accounts that are deployed out to these OUs. You're very much in control of what's there. However, when we're talking about kind of highly prescriptive environments and environments that are really, kind of taking advantage of a lot of the compliance work that we've put in, that's why we built out the universal configuration, right? To be able to be a lot more. This is how we would build an organizational structure with the controls in place, with the SCPs in place, if you wanted to be able to go quickly hydrate and stand up an environment today. So long-winded way of answering your question of, you can ask the LZA to go deploy whatever you want. However, we have opinions about what you should probably go deploy based off of our well-architected frameworks and our security reference architectures. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions? Okay. So Bo and I will obviously stick around for a bit. Happy to kind of dive into kind of more details on what is in the Landing Zone Accelerator and kind of what we're doing, especially within the sovereign region space. So if there's any other questions, feel free to kind of come by. We'll hang out outside and obviously in here for the foreseeable time. But yeah, if you have an opportunity, again, the CloudOps kiosk is in the village. They have swag and demos and workshops that are available that's over there. But yeah, appreciate you coming and taking the time to hear about what we're doing.